Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. We are told that the West is containing China and de-risking supply chains. At the same time, a huge share of the things you touch in one ordinary day, your phone, your car battery, your solar panel, half the hardware in your home router, still depends on Chinese factories, Chinese rare earths, and Chinese logistics. The story is about limits and decoupling. The reality is dependency and quiet integration. And this is where the official story starts to fall apart. China doesn't need a dramatic breakthrough to change the balance of power. It just needs to move a little bit every year. A new port concession here, a rail link there, another battery plant, another currency swap. Step by step, the wiring of the world economy shifts in its direction, while speeches in Brussels and Washington talk about something completely different. If you look at the physical side of the system, the picture is simple and unpleasant. China produces around a third of global manufacturing output. In PPP terms, its economy is already larger than that of the United States. More than 150 countries are involved in some form of Belt and Road cooperation. We don't need exact digits after the comma to see the structure. This is not a regional player. This is one of the main pillars of the global machine. In short, the math doesn't care about our political comfort. There is one number in this whole story that nobody in Brussels likes to say out loud. It's the share of critical inputs for the green transition and high tech that comes, directly or indirectly, from China. We'll get to it. China's method is boring. No fireworks. Ports, railways, industrial parks, long contracts, equity stakes, credit lines, standards. While Western politics rotates in 4-year cycles and social media hysteria, Beijing plays something closer to naval logistics chess, slow pieces, long board. Now here's the part that keeps economists awake at night. When you dominate the boring layers of the system, manufacturing, logistics, minerals, ports, standards, you don't need to threaten anyone directly. Dependency does the work for you. If you're watching this from Germany, your reality is already different from someone in Portugal, simply because your industry chain is more tightly tied into Chinese inputs. China's foreign policy toolkit starts with steel and concrete, not slogans. Look at the ports. Over the last 2 decades, Chinese state-linked firms have taken stakes in terminals across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Often it begins with a minority share in a container terminal. A decade later, the same operator runs most of the port's throughput, the logistics park behind it, and part of the rail link inland. The local headline was Investment and Jobs. Structurally, it's a control point in a global network. This is the structural flaw you can't fix with a press release. The same pattern repeats on land. Rail lines across Central Asia, corridors through Pakistan, road and pipeline links in Africa and Latin America. Each project, by itself, is just a line on a map. Collectively, they are an alternative skeleton of world trade that does not run through traditional Western choke points. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this: power follows infrastructure more reliably than it follows speeches. So, let's take a breath. Where does this leave us so far? On paper, the West is reducing dependence on China and defending a rules-based order. In practice, the physical and logistical backbone of global trade is quietly shifting toward networks where Chinese capital, companies, and standards are deeply embedded. And this brings us to the one number that changes the entire equation. In many core green technologies that Europe publicly treats as its future, solar panels, batteries, rare earth magnets, a large share of the supply chain, in some cases the majority of processing capacity, sits in or around China. The exact percentage varies by segment, but the direction is consistent. Without Chinese inputs, a big part of the European energy transition stalls. This number is the quiet part, said out loud. Now, let's look at the incentives. For the United States, the story is almost open. Contain a rising peer competitor, protect technological leadership, keep control over the financial system and sea lanes. For China, the logic is more patient and more defensive. Avoid direct military confrontation, break out of encirclement in the Pacific, and make sure that any attempt to cut it off from markets and resources hurts everyone else at least as much. The public rhetoric is about cooperation and win-win. The actual playbook is about reducing vulnerability and increasing leverage. Europe sits in the middle. Officially, it talks about de-risking from China, defending values, reducing strategic dependencies. In practice, its firms still fight for access to the Chinese market, its car industry depends on Chinese components, and its green agenda relies on Chinese panels, batteries, and minerals. This is the part no politician wants to explain on TV. For Beijing, this contradiction inside Europe is a gift. No need for loud pressure. Just keep offering contracts, joint ventures, local battery plants, stakes in ports, and gradual settlement of trade in yuan. Every time Europe chooses immediate economic relief over long-term autonomy, the dependency deepens a little. This is where the theory meets a brick wall. If you work in manufacturing or energy, you've seen this movie before. First, cheap inputs from somewhere else make your production more profitable. Then, over time, more and more of the value chain slides abroad. At some point, losing that supplier becomes existential. At that moment, the power relationship flips, and nobody needs to fire a shot. The same quiet pattern repeats in finance. China still operates inside a dollar-centric system, but it has spent years building alternatives. Currency swap lines with dozens of central banks, cross-border payment systems, bilateral trade deals where part of the settlement happens in yuan. On paper, the dollar is still dominant. In practice, more and more countries now have an exit route for at least part of their trade. Here is where the story stops making sense if you only look at flags and not at plumbing. From my corner of Europe, in the Baltics, this looks slightly absurd. Publicly, we are some of the most vocal backers of hard lines and sanctions. But our economies sit inside the same EU market that quietly buys Chinese technology, equipment, and consumer goods, and that indirectly benefits from the lower costs created by Chinese overcapacity in sectors like solar and batteries. This is the moment when a geopolitical stance turns into a line item on your electricity bill and your factory's input costs. Now, here's the uncomfortable question. Does this look like a strategy or just managed decline with better PR? Let's go back to the slow steps. Take critical minerals. China spent decades building dominance in rare earth mining and, more importantly, processing. It is not that other countries have no deposits. It's that processing capacity, environmental tolerance, and industrial policy aligned in China earlier and more aggressively. As a result, many high-tech components elsewhere depend on materials that pass through Chinese facilities. You see the problem here, right? The same approach appears in standards and technology. Whether it is 5G infrastructure, smart grids, or electric vehicles, Chinese firms push their own technical standards into contracts, especially in the global south. Once a country builds its network on one standard, switching becomes expensive. The public rhetoric is about connectivity and development. The private briefings are about market share and lock-in. So let's reset again. We have a system where China does not shout about world leadership every week, but accumulates leverage in supply chains, ports, data networks, payments, and standards. Western elites talk a lot about values and security, but often outsource the dirty work of production and extraction to the same player they claim to be containing. In short, the math of dependency does not match the language of strategy. Now, how does this hit ordinary people? Start with energy and the green transition. European households are told that higher prices today are an investment in a clean future and independence from authoritarian suppliers. Then they discover that the cheapest solar panels and many of the batteries still arrive from factories in or linked to China. If tensions escalate and those flows are disrupted, the result is not a noble stand for democracy. It is delayed projects, higher bills, and failed climate targets. This is the structural flaw you can't fix with a conference speech. For small and medium manufacturers in Europe, especially in places like Germany, Italy, or Central Europe, the dependence is even more blunt. Machine tools, components, electronics, chemicals, many of these now arrive cheaper from Chinese suppliers than they can be produced locally. Compete with them and you get squeezed on price. Lose them, and your entire product line is at risk. Either way, the negotiating position shifts away from you. If you're watching this from a smaller EU state, the picture is even more asymmetric. Big countries at least have some leverage. Market size, political weight in Brussels, the ability to negotiate sectoral deals. Small states mostly get the bill. Your local politician can shout something symbolic about China or invite a Taiwanese delegation, but when Beijing decides to quietly restrict trade or redirect flows, your exporters feel it immediately, and there is very little you can do except complain inside the EU system and hope somebody in a larger capital notices. There's another layer that almost never makes it into public debate. Time horizons. China's political system has its own pathologies, but it does allow for projects that unfold over 20 or 30 years. Western democracies, especially in Europe, have hollowed out their strategic capacity to the point where almost everything is subordinated to short election cycles and financial markets. When one side is building corridors, ports, and standards for 2050, and the other side is thinking about the next quarterly report and opinion poll, the outcome is not hard to predict. This is the part no serious strategist can laugh away. Now, here is the part that keeps security planners awake at night. None of this requires China to win a conventional war against anyone. It only needs enough leverage that any coalition contemplating open confrontation has to ask a very simple question. How much disruption can our own economies and societies tolerate? When your logistics, your tech base, and your energy transition all depend on the same external node, escalation becomes a lot less attractive. The cost of bravery, as measured in lost jobs and political chaos, rises sharply. So, let's take one last breath and compress the picture. We are not living in a world where China suddenly takes over by dramatic moves. We are living in a world where, year after year, the quiet arithmetic of infrastructure, trade, standards, and finance shifts the system's center of gravity. Europe talks about autonomy while tying its green future and industrial base to external inputs it does not control. The US talks about maintaining leadership while outsourcing chunks of manufacturing and letting financialized capitalism hollow out its own production base. The Global South takes what is on the table: roads, ports, power plants, telecom networks, mostly without lectures. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this: geopolitical power today is not a Hollywood scene with flags on a hill. It is a spreadsheet of who controls which port, which rail hub, which mineral processing facility, which set of technical standards, and which payment pipes. In too many of these cells, China's name is already there, often quietly, often through intermediaries, but firmly. Here is where the story stops making sense if we still pretend this is a marginal player that can be contained by press conferences. The likely trajectory is not a clean victory for anyone, but a slow, grinding adjustment where Western elites discover step by step how much room they no longer have. The bills will land first on those who are least responsible and least protected: ordinary households, small businesses, and smaller states with big flags and small economies. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and try to remember, slogans don't power grids. Systems do.